Every time someone tells me that they are a DevOps engineer, I laugh a little bit, and you might think, what am I on about? DevOps engineer, that's a pretty common title, that's a pretty common job. A lot of people do it. There are a lot of highly paid engineers. What's really wrong with it? And if you don't know the history of DevOps, you might not find this weird at all. But if you do, you'll understand why I'm making this a thing. So let's go back a little bit to the time when there was nothing called DevOps. When we used to write software, there were two groups mainly, the developer teams, and then there was the operations teams. Both of these teams were in what we call the IT department in companies that had some technological arm. There weren't as many technology-centric companies as there are today, where their main business is building software. The developer teams were responsible for building the applications, integrating different systems, and there was the operations team. They had different subgroups, for example, system administrators, database administrators, they had network engineers. Each one of these subspecialty was focused on their own thing. So for example, the network engineers were responsible for making sure that the networking was properly laid out, that the routers are properly functioning and configured. They were managing the firewalls. The system administrators were responsible for making sure that the servers are appropriately configured, the latest security patches are installed, that nobody had access where they shouldn't have access. The database administrators were responsible for managing these monolithic databases like Oracle, for example. When the developers finished working on their code, they would normally package their application in some way. Maybe even there were some integration teams specifically dedicated to integrate the work of multiple developer teams and creating a single binary or a package that can be deployed. And then they would throw this package over to the operations team, who were responsible for deploying this application and making sure that it runs. Now, you might not find this weird. Some of you might, depending on which era you entered software engineering and you started working professionally in it. However, there were many problems with this model, because if you are developers yourselves, you would know that an application working on your machine is no guarantee that it will work anywhere else. And if you're not the person managing the infrastructure, the applications, the dependencies for your application, the configuration, and everything necessary for the code to run appropriately, you're gonna face a lot of unexpected problems, because there are so many variables that are brought on by these other teams or by the environment. And no matter how much these two teams will communicate, there's always going to be some missing information that is never going to be conveyed with high fidelity. Now, everything started changing in 2007 when so-called Patrick DuBois was working in the operations team, and he was responsible specifically for the testing of a data center migration. He obviously experienced many frustrations, because if you're working in the ops, the code of of certain applications is pretty much a black box. You don't really know how it's working internally. You just have a set of conditions and requirements that you need to fulfill, but many things could go wrong, as many of you are aware. Now, moving on to 2008, there was an Agile Conference in Toronto. Andrew Schaefer was supposed to give a talk there that is titled Agile Infrastructure. Now, Andrew has received a lot of hate and heat for this talk, because everybody thought, what is this ridiculous idea? Except for Patrick. Patrick was quite excited about it, because there was finally someone who was voicing out his frustrations and maybe thinking of a better model or a better way of doing things. Patrick came to the talk only to discover that the room was empty. There was no one in it. Even Andrew himself did not attend his own scheduled talk. Patrick was obviously not satisfied by this, so he chased Andrew down, and they started discussing in the hallways how they could change the way this field operates. Now, nothing really happened until 2009, when Paul Hammond and John Alspo gave a talk that is titled 10 plus deploys a day, devs and ops cooperation at Flickr. Patrick ended up watching the streaming of this lecture. It obviously highly resonated with him, and motivated by this, he arranged for a small gathering of system administrators and software engineers. This event was called DevOps Days, and it was held in October 2009. Now, fast forwarding to 2010, this event has garnered a lot of attention. The hashtag DevOps was trending on Twitter, and by that point, smaller technology enterprises were starting to pay attention to this, and DevOps gained a grassroots following of members who were quite excited to share their expertise and new ways of working. Now, in March of 2011, Cameron Haight of Gartner started talking about DevOps, and he had a positive outlook that more enterprises will be adopting it in the future. And rightly so, as if it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, more enterprises started adopting DevOps practices, and they started bridging this gap between developer teams and operational teams. In 2015, DevOps was incorporated into the Scaled Agile framework. I have many reservations about this stuff, but we're just talking history right now. And obviously the DevOps practices got even more attention and popularity. 2018, 2019, DevOps was even more incorporated. Now, we did not really explain what DevOps is. We talked a little bit about the history of it, but what the heck is DevOps? Now, here's the kicker. DevOps was supposed to bridge the gap between developer teams and operational teams. Mainly, it was supposed to make the developers responsible for managing their own application in production and being the ones at the front lines, dealing with incidents, resolving problems that arise from their own changes and from the changes they introduce to their software. It was also supposed to allow the developers to manage the infrastructure where their applications runs. That doesn't mean that we obliterate system administrators, infrastructure engineers, network engineers from the equation. However, that means that we give more control to the developers so that they are more responsible for the outcome of their work, as opposed to with them throwing their deliverables over the fence and then another team is responsible for those outcomes, positive or negative. So the reason why I laugh when someone says they are a DevOps engineer is because we have simply changed titles. When you are a DevOps engineer working in a team composed of other DevOps engineers, what did we do? We came back full circle. We came back to the beginnings. We came back to the point where the developers were on one side and the operations team was on the other side. But all we did today was simply change the title of the folks who were in the ops team from system administrator, database administrator, network administrator, and whatever, to DevOps engineers. And we made it even worse because now we assume that these DevOps engineers know everything about these subspecialties and that they have all of that information, allowing them to cover a much bigger landscape and even hold more responsibility. And nothing really changed when we have DevOps departments and DevOps engineers who are working in a silo as opposed to be deeply integrated within developer teams, even developers themselves owning that infrastructure. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that every developer needs to be an infrastructure engineer, network engineer, so on and so forth, but they have to build these skills if they are to build applications that function. They have to understand this environment where their application is hosted, where it is running, and where it is living. Otherwise, it's chaos all over again. Some people say DevOps is a culture. Some people say it's ways of working. Some people say it's a set of processes and procedures. In its essence, DevOps is anything necessary to bridge the gap between the developer teams and the operations teams, whatever that may look like. Different enterprises can implement DevOps differently. There is no one way that works everywhere. And everybody who's trying to convince you otherwise is, in my opinion, selling some form of snake oil. And this is why understanding the why is important.